in this module, I want to talk about viruses and worms. This is another a la carte subject matter here, very similar to Trojans, but different because the context has changed to viruses and worms. So let's go ahead and get started, okay? So a couple major components here. We've got the basic concepts we'll cover, the different stages of a virus, why did people even do this in the first place, the different tools in which we can use, the different types. We'll talk a little bit about malware analysis, and then the distribution techniques, and then we'll wrap up with some of the countermeasures that are probably most common used in the industries. So let's start talking about some of the major concepts first. Well, ultimately, a virus and worm is going to change the integrity of your target, right? So you basically have the alteration of some sort of data. Remember that this software has to get to the system. Now, from a virus point of view, a human has to basically click the virus or start the virus, where a worm can replicate on its own. It does not need a human involved. Ultimately, that's going to lead to some sort of corruption of data or files or system resources. And so that's really the big picture. Also, the different propagation techniques, as a virus writer or worm writer, how am I going to get this thing out to the internet or to my targets so that ultimately I can get an infection? Ultimately, I want to get it out there and get an infection, but I also don't want to be detected right away. So I have to come up with some sort of mechanism to actually, how am I going to hide this? And this is where viruses like multipartite or terminate and stay resident or polymorphic, these types of hiding techniques or stealth or tunneling techniques come into play. Also, same thing with mutation, right? This goes more into how is the defensive person going to detect my virus or worm. Is it a signature-based system or an anomaly-based system? And every time that they try to detect, can I mutate and come up with some other version of this software so that ultimately I can keep my infection out there the longest possible way. Also, integrity. Now remember, in the early parts of penetration testing, everything that we did was focused on disclosure. But now that we're into the big picture of system hacking or Trojans and viruses and worms, these are realistically the principle of integrity in play, because we are changing our targets and our networks and the corporations, okay? So let's back up and let's look at the different stages in which a virus or a worm goes through. All right, somebody's got to design the virus, and this is where you, the penetration tester or the hacker or the white hat or the black hat or the gray hat, come into play. You have to design it. Most of the time, you could write the code yourself, in the very, very manual way. But if you wanted to take the script kiddie way, you could use one of the virus or construction kits, virus worm construction kits that are out there. And we'll talk about those in a minute. So you got to design the virus, then you actually have to get it out there. So what are the replication techniques? Ultimately, once it's out there, some user or computer is going to have to get infected, so there's got to be a launching mechanism. With a virus, the user launches it. With a worm, the system can get infected without the user even being involved. Then ultimately, we're going to need a way to detect this and then ultimately remove it. All right, but let's back up here for a second and talk about launching it. Some techniques, like fragmentation techniques, are very, very popular in terms of how do you actually get this piece of code to launch. So you can move executable code around, you can rewrite headers, and things like that in terms of fragmentation, and that can aid in your increasing the likelihood of actually getting the virus to launch. Detecting. Well, how is somebody going to detect the virus or the worm, okay? So you could naturally scan for it with some sort of host-based or network-based antivirus software. You could use an integrity platform like Tripwire or some sort of integrity monitoring or hashing program to basically compare what's been changed on that system, or intercepted at some sort of gateway relay point like a mail server or a strategic network location, or actually on your end hosts as well. And then ultimately remove it which is most of the time what the system administrators have to deal with, right? So they go up, hey, detected with a virus or worm, let's go ahead and fix it. So most system admins pick up here, but most penetration testers, they do all of the pre-work, the designing, the replication, the launching, and trying to avoid detection for as long as possible. So the cool part about viruses, Trojans, and worms is like you actually get to think like a criminal. All right. In an ethical situation, when you're a paid penetration tester, you have a permission slip to basically accomplish some result for an organization proactively and help an organization go through these scenarios and then help them develop the countermeasures so that it actually doesn't happen in a live real world circumstance. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about why. Why even do this? Right? Why should the hacker or the penetration tester even do this, right? So for, I guess, more from a malicious point of view, well, perhaps there's some sort of financial gain, right? Maybe it's simply to play a prank. Maybe it's more terrorism or destruction oriented, where you're actually trying to accomplish some sort of malicious objective. It could be like an I hate you messages that you want to send. Maybe it's a political campaign. Nonetheless, it's something that typically changes the availability of your target. In other words, knocks them offline or something to that effect. Okay. Let's talk about the different types of viruses and worms, okay? There's boot sector viruses that infect the boot sector. There's file or multi-party, which not only infect the boot sector, but also infect the partition tables and things like that. There's your old classic macro virus. You have the ones in red here are actually kind of more modern techniques, where macro is kind of a little traditional. It's been around for probably decades now, but the new latest and greatest are like tunneling concepts, tunneling through ICMP or tunneling through HTTP or tunneling in general. Or sparse. There's a type of virus called a sparse infector virus, which would wake up, let's say, on the 15th of every month and then pop up for a while, infect a bunch of systems, and then hide itself. And so really what that does for the network administrator makes them run around like a dog chasing their tail. They think they've got everything fixed, and then the next month comes around and boom, it's back again. So it's literally this get the network administrator to chase their own tail. Polymorphic. Great technique because it, how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. Poly, many, morphic changes. So this virus or worm goes through many changes or many iterations of its code, ultimately to avoid detection. The same thing with metamorphic. While polymorphic changes its signature, generally metamorphic is identified by changing the characters which are used. So it might go from a lowercase a to an uppercase a or to an outsign. And it's kind of an older technique. Shell infecting viruses, cavity viruses which erode or eat away at files or file systems, or one of my favorites, terminate and stay resident. It's my favorite because realistically the system administrator thinks that the software is gone, but it's still in memory, and then you can use other applications to trigger a relaunching of the program. So unless the system administrator reboots all of their system and flushes out their memory, it can pop back up and hey, surprise, we're now infected again. So that's one of my favorite ones. Let's talk about distribution. Well, there's different ways in which you have to get your software infected, or your virus or your worm infected on your targets. So part of this is just good search engine optimization, right? If you can get a highly ranked web page and, think of it this way. Would you rather be on the first page of a major search engine or page 100, right? If you can get your virus or link or something like that at a higher ranking, you increase the likelihood of your infection. So SEO and clickjacking, realistically, in my opinion, work very, very, very closely together. Clickjacking is just taking over HTML code or the links or the clicks that we click on, and actually takes you to some sort of malicious source where you'll get a pop-up or be forced to download some sort of code. Or maybe it's a phishing or spear phishing or a whaling style email in which your target now clicks on a link in an email and then is forced to install some code or a worm. Or maybe it's through traditional malicious software or malware. Or maybe it's a legitimate website that has been taken over by a hacker or an attacker. This is a lot more common than you think. For example, it may just seem like a run-of-the-mill website, but if a hacker or an attacker found a backdoor and they upload their phishing scam to that, well, they might not be changing the integrity for you, the end user of that website, or realistically caring about hacking your database or really knocking you offline. They're just using you as a host to host their phishing scam so that they can go attack the world and lure everybody else. So they're just using your resources. So you got to watch websites. Also, drive-by. One of the classic examples of drive-by infections is, free Wi-Fi. People are walking in New York City, for example, and they see, oh, here's a hotspot, it's free Wi-Fi. They click on that, it runs a little piece of code, and it changes their device to now being a free access point. So in theory, everybody that walks by or drives by that specific access point turns their access point into free Wi-Fi, which then infects, and then infects, and then infects, and before you know it, the whole world is now connected with free Wi-Fi. All right. Let's move on to malware analysis. We're going to need some sort of analysis environment. So the concept really comes from farming. Have you ever heard of a sheep dip? If I ask you that, you'd probably say, no, I've never heard of a sheep dip machine. Well, think about a farm, or if you ever had a pet, you probably have given them a flea and tick bath. Well, what that flea and tick bath was a way to remove the bugs. All right? So if you can insert your code into some sort of virtual machine or virtual environment or isolated environment, and then allow that code to infect the virtual or isolated environment, well, then you can run all of your port scanners, your registry detection tools, all of your analysis tools that you possibly have, and then basically see how those infections take place. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we look at some of the tools. Okay? Also, some sort of sensor on the network. Either on the desktop or on the server or on the network. You need some way to detect a virus or worm. And I typically chalk that up to just like antivirus software, at least for now. But the latest and greatest way to do this is basically through virtual machine software, although you realistically could have a dedicated machine that's isolated, not plugged into the network. It's just nowadays, it's really realistically easy to accomplish that through virtual machines. Let's go on to indicators. Well, if you want to know the indicators of any virus or worm, use a tool. Use these construction kits, because you can literally point and click and see things like, change your right and left click of your mouse buttons, open and close your CD-ROM drawer, display funny text on the screen, flip your monitor, right? So if you want to learn all of the infection techniques or indicators of an infection, it's pointless for me to actually talk about that. It is priceless for me to actually show you. So when we move on to the hands-on part, I'm going to show you actually how to use these tools or the construction kits, and that's where we'll actually cover the different indicators of the attack. Okay? So before we get into the conclusions, let's just back up 1 second here. Concepts, major concepts: alteration, corruption, propagation, hiding, mutation, and integrity. These are all really important concepts for you, the penetration tester, to master so that you can actually be fluent in the language of viruses and worms. You have to know the major life cycle of the stages. While the reason why could be any and various, here's just a common. The different types: you could go to any major antivirus vendor and search for a particular virus by name, and it'll probably have some sort of type listed to that, along with the impact of the virus, the worm, or the code. You should also set up, a pen tester should also have their malware analysis lab and know all of the common ways to distribute them. Okay, so we'll go into countermeasures, and then I'll move into a little bit about tools. So you have, as a penetration tester, you have to understand what countermeasures are commonly in play. If you understand that piece of it, well, that's going to help you get just that much more creative so that your virus, your worm, your Trojan actually gets an infection. No sense just throwing the spaghetti against the wall and it not sticking, right? Because you waste a lot of time, effort, money, and resources on basically something that's not going to work if you don't understand what countermeasures are in play, right? So how does antivirus work? And we talked a little bit about this, but major categories are: you have integrity-based systems, you have knowledge and signature or rule-based systems, or you have profile, anomaly, statistical, and behavior-based systems. Knowing those three major categories, integrity, signature, or anomaly, that's going to help you avoid being detected in your virus, worm, or Trojan. Also, knowing what policies are in place inside that organization. Is it a high secure organization or is it a low secure organization? Most of the times you can get this simply by going to the front desk of the organization. And do they have simple things like sign-in sheets or not? If they don't, well, then they probably are not going to have a robust human resources or policy-based approach to computers or computer security. Also, does the organization or client have a good, robust, timely, keyword there, timely patch management process? Because that is what indicates, how much time I have to get my virus, my worm, my Trojan infected. Hardening. What's my surface area of attack? What are my different ways in? How much are users trained on the subject matter of viruses, worms, and Trojans? All right, that's huge. Now, of course, this is training based, but if you go in and you just ask people, what's the phone number to the help desk, and they can't even tell you that, well, that tells you a lot about that culture. Also, you could tie in the maturity of the organization. Is it a low maturity, like a CMM level 1, or is it a high maturity that focuses on process improvement, like a CMM level 5? Also, who are you even talking to? Do you even authenticate the senders? Do people just pick up the phone and go, yes, Leo here? Or do they actually say, prove it? Prove that Leo is who Leo claims to be. You can do this nowadays through CAC cards and public key infrastructure. This is a major, major component. Also, having the ability to scan and detect for viruses and worms. Good firewall and access control list. This tells you what ports and protocols, source and destination IP addresses can traverse the network. If you can lock down, who's allowed to talk and who's not allowed to talk, that could shut off a lot of virus replication, or at least shut down the IPs and ports from a proactive standpoint. And also different blockers, like pop-up blockers or adware. So you have to be fluent with the different types of countermeasures. You have to know the distribution. You have to be fluent with the different types of viruses. You have to know the different stages. And only after you understand all of that, then can you actually move into the tools, okay? Because these are some of the popular tools that are out there, at least in the script kiddie land, which will cover the basics of, I don't want to say mastery of this subject matter, but at least it'll get you pretty confident in your penetration testing skills if you use tools like Terabit or JPS or Delmi or Internet Worm Maker Thing, or you're using analysis tools like Bintext or Ali or IdaPro or something like that. So only when you understand all of these moving components of viruses, worms, and Trojans can you, the penetration tester, actually go out and have a career doing this, okay? Now there's a couple pieces here, offensively versus defensively. You have to be able to work both ways. Defensively, because if you know how the defense works, that's going to make your offense just that much stronger. So it doesn't matter what side of the fence you come on here. If you come from the offensive background or a defensive background, knowing the other side of the fence is going to help you in your mastery of viruses, worms, and Trojans. So let's go ahead and look at some of the hands-on examples.